Of all the stories I've told, few carry the kind of weight that lingers after the final word is spoken. The events you're about to hear are not soaked in gore or filled with sensational violence. Instead, they are carried by something far heavier: the truth of a life shaped by hardship, faith, and an impossible choice. This is the story of a man who walked through shadows, who fell to the lowest depths and somehow climbed back, scarred yet redeemed. His name is Ephraim Matos. And once you've heard his journey, I believe you'll understand why this tale stands among the most disturbing, yet inspiring, stories I've ever come across. I first met Ephraim during the brutal crucible of Navy SEAL training. If you've ever seen footage of BUD/S, the Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL program, you know it's designed to break people. Weeks without proper sleep, days filled with punishment from the instructors, the ocean gnawing at your bones, sand grinding into every pore of your skin. The training is notorious not only for its physical intensity, but for the mental warfare waged against each candidate. I remember one day vividly. It was one of those mornings when the cold Pacific swallowed us whole. The instructors had us line up on the beach, shivering in the surf zone, as they shouted about how easy it would be to quit. All we had to do was ring a brass bell hanging in the center of camp. That bell was polished to a shine, standing there like a silent promise of relief. Ring it once, and you were done. You could go back to warmth, to sleep, to normalcy. Most of the men I stood beside that morning had eyes locked on the bell. I could see the cracks forming in their spirits, the whispers in their minds urging them to give in. And that was the point of the instructor's cruelty, not to test muscles, but to crush willpower. But when I glanced at Ephraim, I saw something different. He wasn't staring at the bell. He wasn't staring at the ground. His gaze was lifted, locked on something far beyond the misery of the moment. Later, when I asked him about it, he told me he wasn't thinking about quitting or about the pain. He was thinking about God. It struck me deeply, because in that place most men clung to thoughts of home, of wives or girlfriends, of warm beds. But Ephraim's anchor wasn't in the world around him. It was in a faith so strong it seemed to shield him from despair. But faith, like steel, is forged in fire. And what Ephraim carried into that training was not the product of an easy life. He had grown up in circumstances that could have broken anyone. Poverty, neglect, darkness. Those shadows stalked him from the time he was a child. He never went into great detail about all the wounds of his past, but the little he did share was enough to paint the picture. Imagine a boy with no steady ground beneath his feet. A boy who learned early that the world can be cruel, and that sometimes the people who should protect you are the very ones who fail you. He could have stayed in that pit forever. He could have let bitterness harden his heart, could have turned to the same cycles of destruction that claim so many lost kids. But something in him refused to give up. Instead, he turned his face upward. He clung to God, not in the shallow way that so many do when they're comfortable, but with the desperate grip of someone who knows that without faith, he has nothing. That, I believe, is what made him different. That is what gave him the kind of strength you don't see in ordinary men. During training, I watched him push past limits that broke others. I saw him carry not only his own weight, but often the weight of his teammates. Ephraim had this way of shouldering burdens that weren't his, as if he'd been born to lift others out of despair because he knew what it was like to be trapped there. When we weren't being screamed at or ordered to run another impossible distance, we sometimes shared quiet moments. I asked him once, "Why are you here? Why put yourself through this hell?" He paused, eyes distant, then said, "Because I know what it feels like to have no one. I want to be the one who shows up when others are abandoned. I want to fight for the people who can't fight for themselves." Those words have never left me. Ephraim eventually earned his trident. He became one of us, a Navy SEAL. And though that accomplishment alone is something few men in history can claim, his story didn't end there. In many ways, it was just beginning. After leaving the SEAL teams, he felt a pull towards something even more dangerous, something less structured, but more deeply aligned with his convictions. He traveled to Iraq, not under the command of the U.S. military, but as part of a volunteer effort to help civilians trapped in the chaos of war. Mosul, Iraq. The city was a hellscape. Bombs shook the ground, sniper fire cracked through the air, and civilians were caught in the middle of it all: men, women, children, families who had nowhere to run. The Islamic State controlled large swaths of the city, and anyone left behind was either enslaved or slaughtered. Ephraim joined a small band of volunteers who risked everything to rescue those people. They weren't fighting for medals or recognition. They were fighting for lives. One day stands out above the rest. It's the day Ephraim would later call the Shadow Road. The streets of Mosul were littered with rubble, buildings reduced to skeletons of stone. The stench of smoke and blood clung to the air, heavy enough to choke. Civilians were pinned down, trapped between ISIS snipers and the advancing coalition forces. Families huddled behind broken walls, terrified to move. Ephraim and his team made the decision to cross what was essentially a kill zone, a stretch of open street watched by enemy rifles. They knew stepping into that space was almost certain death. But if they didn't, dozens of civilians would never make it out alive. As they prepared, Ephraim prayed. He told me later that it wasn't a grand, poetic prayer. Just a simple cry. God, give me strength. Use me. Then he stepped onto the road. Bullets cracked past him immediately, snapping the air like whips. Dust leapt from the ground at his feet. He sprinted, heart pounding, not for glory, not for himself, but for the terrified faces he could see peeking from the shadows. He reached them, urged them to move, shielded them with his own body as they ran. Time and again he went back, crossing that deadly stretch, dragging the wounded, lifting children, guiding mothers. And then it happened. A shot rang out, sharper than the rest. Pain exploded in his leg, dropping him to the ground. Blood poured as the world blurred around him. For a moment, he thought that was the end. That he would die there, on that road, far from home, his story cut short. But even as darkness closed in, he felt something greater than fear. He felt peace. A strange, unshakable peace, as if the hand of God was still on him, whispering that his life was not over yet. Ephraim survived that day. He was pulled from the street, his wound treated, his life spared. But the experience left a scar far deeper than the one on his body. He had seen the worst of humanity, terrorists who used children as shields, who slaughtered innocents without hesitation. He had also seen the best, ordinary men and women risking everything to save strangers. And somewhere in that crucible of fire and blood, he understood his purpose more clearly than ever. He wasn't called to chase comfort or safety. He was called to walk the shadow roads, to stand where others fled, to be light in the darkest places. When I think of Ephraim, I think of that moment on the beach during SEAL training, when his eyes were lifted, fixed not on the bell that promised escape, but on something higher. That same upward gaze carried him through Mosul, through pain, through fear, through the very valley of death. His story disturbs me because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That evil is real, that suffering is unavoidable, and that sometimes the cost of doing what's right is nearly everything. But it also inspires me, because it proves that even in the deepest shadows, light can break through. This is only the beginning of Ephraim's story. What I've shared here is just part one, the road of shadows. There are more chapters, more battles, more revelations still to come. And if you stay with me, you'll hear them. But I warn you, once you've walked this road, you may never see the world the same way again. The story of Ephraim Matos doesn't end on that blood-stained road in Mosul, nor does it end with the scars stitched across his body. If anything, that moment was only a punctuation mark, an agonizing comma in the long sentence of his life. The wound could have silenced him, confined him, left him bitter and broken. But Ephraim was never the kind of man who let pain become his prison. He carried it instead like a weapon, a reminder that life is both fragile and sacred, and that survival itself is not the finish line. It's the beginning of a duty. After he returned from Mosul, the doctors told him what men like him never want to hear. Slow down, heal, rest. For a while he did. His body demanded it. But the silence of hospital walls and the sterile hum of machines left too much space for memories to creep in. Faces of children clinging to their mothers. The desperate cries of the wounded. The hollow echo of gunfire rattling through ruined streets. These were not scenes Ephraim could forget, because to him they weren't images, they were lives. Lives worth saving, and lives still in danger. So he made a decision. He would not let his injury mark the end of his service. Instead, he would transform it into a doorway to something larger. He left behind the uniform of the Navy SEALs, left behind the role of the lone rescuer, and began to build something that reached farther than his own two hands ever could. He founded an organization dedicated to helping civilians in war zones, ordinary families stranded in extraordinary nightmares. It was more than charity, it was a continuation of the vow he made as a young man, to be there when no one else would. The world is rarely kind to men who try to stand between the innocent and the abyss. Most who attempt it are chewed up and forgotten, their stories lost to time. But Ephraim refused to vanish into obscurity. His faith, The same faith that steadied him on the frigid sands of SEAL training, the same faith that whispered to him in the middle of Mosul, burned brighter than before. In interviews and quiet conversations, he often described his life as a road paved with shadows but lit by God. He never claimed to be fearless. He never pretended that he didn't struggle. He admitted to nightmares, to wounds that no surgeon could ever close. And yet, in the very same breath, he would speak of peace. Peace that passes understanding, peace born not of comfort but of conviction. The Ephraim I knew was not a man who glorified violence. He didn't tell his story for applause. He told it as a warning, as a plea, and as a testimony. A warning that evil is real and spreading. A plea that others would not turn their eyes away from suffering. And a testimony that light is stronger than darkness, but only if someone is willing to carry it. It's easy to hear stories like this and file them away under extraordinary, as if they belong to a different category of life, something unattainable for ordinary people. But that's not what Ephraim wanted. He wanted his story to be a mirror, one that forces each of us to ask uncomfortable questions. What would you risk to save another life? What comfort would you abandon if it meant protecting the weak? What faith would you cling to when the world around you collapses? Most of us may never set foot on a battlefield or sprint across a sniper's crosshairs. But every day, in smaller ways, we are given choices. Choices to look away from suffering or to step into it. Choices to live only for ourselves or to shoulder someone else's burden. Choices to ring the bell of comfort or to keep moving forward through the storm. Ephraim's life is not simply about war. It's about the war within us. The fight between apathy and action, between fear and faith. That's why this story matters, and that's why I chose to tell it. If you've stayed with me this long, you've walked a hard road. You've seen shadows that most people spend their lives trying to avoid. And yet, here you are, still listening, still carrying the weight of Ephraim's journey. That means something. It means you're not afraid to confront the darkness. It means you're willing to let a story change you. So let me leave you with this. Ephraim's road is not over, and neither is yours. His story continues, through his work, through the lives he saves, through the faith that anchors him still. And your story continues too. Maybe you're not called to a battlefield in Iraq, but you are called to something. To stand for truth. To defend the voiceless. To walk your own shadow road, wherever it may lead. We don't always get to choose the battles we face. But we do get to choose whether we stand or fall, whether we surrender or fight, whether we let the darkness define us or we become the light that breaks through it. When I close my eyes and think of Ephraim, I don't picture the blood or the rubble, or even the bullet that nearly ended him. I picture his eyes on that beach, the day when everyone else looked toward the brass bell, and he looked higher. That's the essence of his story. That's the essence of hope. The shadow road is not about glory. It's not about medals. It's about one truth, that even in the places where humanity seems lost, redemption is possible. Even in the deepest night, the dawn still comes. This, then, is not just the end of part 1. It is an invitation to walk with me into the rest of the story. An invitation to step onto roads you may never have imagined, to hear the echoes of courage in the middle of despair, and to ask yourself, what would you do when the shadows call? Because they will call. For each of us, in ways both big and small. And when they do, remember Ephraim. Remember his faith, his pain, his determination. Remember that he did not walk alone. And neither will you. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see the world just a little differently, I'd ask you to do one simple thing. Help us keep telling stories like this. Like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts and subscribe to the channel. Your support ensures that we can continue to bring forward the narratives that matter, the ones that inspire, disturb, and awaken. This was The Shadow Road, Part 1. Stay with me for what comes next, because the story is far from over.